As a child, my foster family made me forget who I was. 60 years later, I built a house where those who were also tried to be erased come to visit. Now my name hangs at the entrance. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. What city are you from? Write in the comments. They told me my name was Molly. It sat in my mouth like soap. Too sweet. Too smooth. Too pale. The first time I heard it, I didn't understand they were talking to me. The woman, my new mother, they said it over and over, louder each time, her voice snapping like a screen door in the wind. Molly, Molly, that's you now. Say it back. So I did. I said it with the stiffness of a child choking on a foreign object. But my real name, the one whispered in the wind, in the lullabies my birth mother sang when no one was listening, was already buried. I was 5. Old enough to remember. Old enough to forget. The house they brought me to was clean in a way that made you ashamed. The kind of clean that made your breath tight. White curtains that never moved. Beige carpets with invisible lines only adults could see. I learned early not to step where they hadn't vacuumed, not to speak at the dinner table unless spoken to, and never, under any circumstance, to ask questions about where I came from. The answer was always the same. We saved you. The walls were hung with portraits of people I never met, with eyes that followed me like they were watching a mistake unfold. There were no mirrors low enough for me to see myself. My room had a bed too big for a small girl, and a closet too empty to matter. When they dressed me for church, they tied ribbons so tight I felt my thoughts go quiet. I was meant to be small, soft, grateful, pretty in a way that erased me. They didn't like my hair. On Saturdays, they sat me down in the kitchen next to the sink with the clattering pipes, and they pulled. They straightened and yanked as if my curls were a problem to be solved. My scalp learned silence. They said it made me look presentable. Presentable for what? I never understood. But I let them press me into something flat and tidy, because the punishment for protest was always the same. The silent treatment. A cold that crept under my skin and stayed there for days. My skin, that was another thing. Too dark to blend in, too light to belong. I was told to stay out of the sun so I wouldn't turn brown. My arms, when tanned, made the church ladies stare. One of them once gave me a bar of soap wrapped in ribbon. "For your elbows," she said, and smiled in a way that made me feel dirty before I'd even opened it. But the thing that hurt the most, that sliced into me like winter wind, was the way they spoke about my name, my old name, the one I remembered only in fragments. They said it sounded uncivilized, unpronounceable, burdensome. They said people like me needed simple names to be accepted. "Molly," they repeated, "is easy. Molly is safe. Molly will get you through life." Safe like a shut mouth, like a locked door, like a lie told often enough that it starts to sound like love. Still, I remembered. At night, under the quilt that smelled of starch and silence, I'd whisper my name into the pillow. Not loud, never loud, but enough for my lips to remember the shape. It didn't feel like language. It felt like blood memory, something old and pulsing. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was mine. It curled behind my teeth, like a seed waiting for rain. In the back of the closet, hidden behind dresses with itchy lace collars, I kept a little box. It wasn't mine. It had belonged to a previous foster girl, long gone. But I claimed it like a buried bone. Inside, I kept the only piece of my past they hadn't thrown away. A leather cord, worn smooth from being touched. It was the kind of thing a child clings to without knowing why. I didn't remember who had given it to me, but I knew I wasn't supposed to have it. I kept it secret, the way some kids keep stolen candy, with guilt and reverence. The box also held a letter. It had no stamp, no address, just my birth name in slanted, looping handwriting. The paper smelled of earth, like it had been buried and dug up. The ink had bled in places, but the words were still legible. I couldn't read all of it. Too many of the words were strange or written in a different tongue. But I knew it came from someone who loved me. Someone who remembered who I was, who I had been before I became Molly. It said things like, "You are the fire of the roots," and "Don't let them pull the song from your bones." It mentioned a name I'd never heard. Etna, a name that made my skin prickle like frost on the back of my neck. When I showed the letter to the woman who called herself my mother, she snatched it from my hand with a look I'd only ever seen in horror movies. She called it witch paper. She said it was dangerous, poison, a reminder of filth. She lit it in the sink. I watched it curl and darken. The flames were quiet, but they screamed in me. That night, I cried so hard I tasted metal. My chest ached like a cracked drum. But I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. I knew better than to be loud. I pulled the cord tighter around my wrist, hid it under my sleeve. In the morning, I smiled when they said, "Good girl." I think that's when the splitting began. When part of me went underground. The part with the real name. The part that smelled like smoke and trees. The part that remembered the sound of my mother's voice, humming something older than America. I buried her. I told her to sleep. But sometimes I could still feel her stirring. Like heat under snow. Years later, I would learn the word for what they did to me. Assimilation. But back then, it was just life. My life. A hollow version of it, painted beige and quiet. A life where my name belonged to someone else, where my voice didn't echo when I called myself. Only once, in the silence of that thick-aired house, did I dare say it out loud. Not a whisper, not a dream. I said it, full and round, as if summoning something from the shadows. Moirin. The sound filled the room like smoke. I waited. No one came. But I swear the walls exhaled. And I, for a moment, remembered how it felt to be real. I was 14 when I ran away. It wasn't the first time I'd thought about it. I had rehearsed the route in my mind 100 times. Out the window, across the backyard, over the fence, down the alley behind the Lutheran church. I knew which gate squeaked and which neighbor kept their dog chained. But until that morning, I had never made it farther than the line of fear that lived just beneath my skin. It was early spring, and the frost was still biting at the grass like memory. I remember the color of the sky, dull blue, the kind that never opens up fully. I stuffed a granola bar into my coat pocket and tucked the leather cord I still wore, now frayed thin as thread, inside my bra. The weight of it felt like breath, as if it were the only real thing on me. I didn't take a bag. I didn't write a note. I wasn't planning to be missed. I had only one destination in mind, drawn not from logic or maps, but from the gravity of a name I had carried in silence for almost a decade. Etna. The letter that had been burned, that had once whispered, "You are the fire of the roots," had mentioned her. The woman whose name clung to the inside of my skull like moss. I didn't know who she was to me, aunt, cousin, myth. But I knew she had once spoken the truth of who I was, and that was enough. It took me hours to reach the edge of town. I walked along roads that didn't have sidewalks, past strip malls and auto shops and half-dead gas stations. My feet ached before I made it even halfway. But the ache felt good. It reminded me I had a body, that I was moving through the world, not as Molly, the girl with the brushed hair and the pressed dresses, but as someone unnamed, someone becoming. No one stopped me. That was the first strange kindness of the day. I passed adults who looked at me and looked away. I passed a school bus and didn't flinch. I passed the boundary of everything I had ever known and walked into a silence so deep it hummed. Her house wasn't on a street. It sat behind a broken fence at the end of a dirt road, choked with weeds and memory. The land was wide and quiet, the kind of quiet that holds breath like a secret. I knew before I even reached the steps that I was in the presence of something unbending. The house was crooked in that way old things are, not ruined, not abandoned, but softened by time. Shutters hung like tired eyelids. The porch sagged as if it were exhaling. But there were signs of life. Wind chimes made from spoons, a line of herbs drying on a string. The door was painted green, not the shiny green of new cars, but the green of deep woods, of shadows, of moss that never lets go. I didn't knock. The door opened before I raised my hand. She stood there, small but full, wrapped in a wool shawl that looked older than the sky. Her hair was white but wild, pulled back with a strip of cloth dyed in muted colours: russet, ash, ochre. Her skin was a map of ridges and constellations. She had the kind of face that made you forget what day it was. She looked at me without blinking, not suspicious, not warm, just present. I had never been looked at like that before. Like I was not a child or a problem or a project, just a fact. She stepped aside. I stepped in. The smell hit me first. Not bad, not sweet either. Just old. Dust and cedar and something herbal I couldn't name. There were no lights on, but the room glowed from windows that seemed to filter time itself. Every surface held a story: jars with handwritten labels, bones and feathers in small wooden bowls, ribbons of cloth twisted into braids and hung on the walls like talismans. A girl who had tasted the truth for one night and lived on its memory for decades. I sold the house. The real estate agent said the market was good. She called it a wise decision. I didn't correct her. I packed my things in silence. Most of it I left behind: furniture, dishes, photo frames with stock images still inside. I kept a box of linens, a tin of old letters, and a worn wooden box with the braid from Etna's house still inside. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I drove north, out of the city, into a town that didn't exist on most maps. It had a main street with 2 stoplights and a gas station that sold jam in recycled jars. The houses were tired. The people looked inward. I liked it immediately. I found the house by accident. Or maybe not. It was half hidden by overgrowth, crouched low behind trees that whispered in a language I recognized in my bones. The roof sagged. The porch was missing slats. One window was cracked. But something about it called to me. It reminded me of Etna's house, or maybe of a version of it I'd invented over the years. A place not for living, but for remembering. I bought it for less than the price of a used car. The man who sold it shook his head and said, "You sure?" I nodded. He handed me the keys like a riddle. I don't think he expected me to last the winter. The first night I slept on the floor. I laid a wool blanket over warped wood and listened to the house breathe. It creaked and moaned like it was trying to speak. I whispered back. The next morning, I opened every window. I let the cold in. I wanted the house to shiver, to wake up. I began the slow work of reclaiming it. Not renovating, not the way people mean it now with smooth countertops and staged lighting, but resurrecting. I peeled back layers of wallpaper like old skin. Underneath, I found wood. Honest wood. Splintered and dry and alive. I sanded it by hand. I didn't rush. Some days I did nothing but sit and listen. I boiled herbs on the stove, rosemary, pine, cedar, and walked through the rooms with a smoking bundle. I hummed the not song I'd heard in Etna's house all those years ago. I didn't know what I was saying, but the walls did. I could feel it. They stopped creaking. They began to settle. One afternoon, as I pulled down the final cabinet, something dropped onto the floor, a folded piece of cloth. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. It was a piece of wool, faded green and brown, with a knot in the center. The same kind of braid Etna had tied around my wrist. It couldn't be hers. It made no sense. And yet, when I touched it, something inside me clicked into place. I wept for the first time in years. Not out of sadness, not even out of joy, but because I knew then what I had to do. The house would not be mine alone. It would be a museum, not a museum of artifacts or trophies or historical footnotes, but a house of memory, of song, of bone and braid and smoke, a place where people like me, the forgotten, the misnamed, the quiet, could stand and be named. I began collecting, slowly, quietly. I wrote to distant relatives. I asked for stories, scraps, photographs. Some ignored me. Others sent boxes. Inside them I found scraps of culture held together with paper clips, a rusted comb, a child's shoe, a worn recipe card with half the words in Gaelic. I cried over all of it. I wasn't building a display. I was building a shrine. I wrote to tribal elders, asking permission to share parts of the story that lived in me. Some were skeptical, others cautious. But a few said yes. A few said thank you. One sent me a shell bracelet with a note. Memory is not ownership, it is responsibility. I placed it in a glass bowl by the window. Let the light touch it. I made a sign for the front of the house. I carved the letters slowly with a kitchen knife and sandpaper. The house of memory. Enter barefoot and with reverence. It didn't look official. That was the point. I didn't know who would come. I didn't know if anyone would. But I knew that I had come back to myself, and that was enough. It began with splinters, not metaphorical ones, real ones. Tiny shards of dry wood that embedded themselves in my palms as I tore up the warped flooring in what used to be the dining room. I didn't mind. Pain had never frightened me. Not the sharp kind, anyway. The pain I feared was the quiet kind, the pain of forgetting. The house was stubborn. Every board, every beam, every rusted nail resisted me at first, like it had grown used to its decay, like it didn't trust me yet. I understood. It had been unloved for too long. You can't heal something until you learn its wounds. I took my time. I worked slowly. I treated each corner like a memory waiting to be uncovered. Behind one layer of drywall, I found newspapers from the 1940s, yellowed and brittle. Headlines about war and victory. Smiling men in uniforms. None of it mattered to the house. That was someone else's history. But in the back room, the one that would become the heart of the museum, I found something different. Beneath peeling paint and a crumbling shelf, etched faintly into the plaster, was a symbol, a spiral. Not decorative, not accidental. Carved with intention, with meaning. I traced it with my fingertips. I didn't know what it meant, not precisely, but I knew what it was. A mark of presence, of belief, of someone who had been here, quietly insisting they mattered. I lit a candle. I sat in that room for hours, just breathing. That's when I began my rituals. Each morning I woke before the sun. I lit herbs in a clay bowl I had bought from a roadside vendor years ago, not knowing why. I boiled water with cedar and rosemary and opened every window. I walked from room to room, humming. Always the same rhythm. The knot song I had learned in Etna's home. The one that had no name, no words, only feeling. I wasn't cleansing. I wasn't purifying. I was introducing myself. And over time, the house responded. The creaks softened. The cold receded. There were mornings when the light fell through the windows just so, landing on certain objects like a spotlight. A cracked bowl, a woven basket, a bundle of feathers I had tied together with an old shoelace. I began to think of the house as a body, and I was learning how to touch it with kindness. My hands grew calloused. My back ached. I lost weight. But I was more alive than I had ever been. I no longer feared mirrors. I saw my face, my real one, and it looked like a story that had finally started telling itself. I set up shelves made from salvaged wood and painted them in colours drawn from the earth: ochre, clay, slate, moss. I labelled nothing. I refused to reduce memory to museum tags. I placed objects in clusters, not according to category, but by resonance. A comb next to a stone, a ribbon beside a rusted key, a baby shoe in a glass jar of feathers. People would ask later what these things meant. I would tell them. They remember what we forgot. Outside, I began clearing the path to the front door. The grass had swallowed the old stone walkway, so I unearthed it, stone by stone, like a trail back to something sacred. That's when the stairs started. Neighbours walked by, slower than usual. Some crossed the street. A few made comments I couldn't quite hear, but I could feel them in my back. Not cruel, just wary, suspicious. As if what I was doing was too strange, too unnecessary, too loud. I didn't flinch. I'd spent a lifetime being small. I was done shrinking. Still, there were moments of doubt. Nights when the wind howled through the empty rooms and I felt like a ghost speaking to an abandoned house. Was anyone listening? Was any of this real? And then she appeared. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply sat, a small girl with dark eyes and a quietness that matched my own. She perched on the steps like a sparrow, elbows on knees, watching the wind play with the grass. I didn't ask her name. I didn't offer her anything. I just let her sit. She came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time, she edged a little closer to the door. One afternoon, she picked up a rag and began wiping dust off the windowsills. I didn't tell her to stop. I didn't thank her. I simply handed her another cloth. We spoke without speaking. She moved like someone who had learned to disappear, shoulders hunched, eyes that didn't meet yours. But her hands were steady. She was careful with the objects, like she understood they weren't just things, but witnesses. One morning I found a feather on the front step, a single black and white plume tied with string. She'd left it, though I never saw her place it. I took it inside and hung it near the spiral carved into the wall. A week later, I found another. A piece of sea glass, then a stone, shaped like a heart. Small offerings, silent affirmations. She was building the house with me. One evening we sat on the porch in silence as the sky turned violet. I handed her a piece of bread. She accepted it without a word. The braid I wore around my wrist, the one Etna had given me, caught the last of the sunlight. Her eyes locked on it. She reached for her pocket and pulled out a tangle of string, awkward and clumsy, braided with uneven knots. She handed it to me like a question. I tied it around her wrist. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. From that day forward, she came every morning. Together we scrubbed, swept, sorted. She chose colours for the walls, deep forest green for the kitchen, soft ash grey for the front room. I let her paint, even when she dripped. Especially when she dripped. Mistakes are part of memory too. I wrote a new sign, carved it from a fallen branch, smoothed it with sandpaper, burned the letters into its surface. The house that memory built. Entry requires no shoes and no shame. We nailed it to the porch beam together. A week later, someone spray-painted the word witch on the mailbox. I left it there. Let them see what they feared. Let them say it aloud. Because what they didn't understand was that the house was no longer mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, to every girl with a name that was taken from her, to every elder whose story was buried beneath a schoolbook, to every child who still carried the scent of ash and cedar on their hands. The house was breathing now, and through it, so was I. The day the journalist came, I was scrubbing the back step with salt water and baking soda. It was something Etna used to do, something about cleansing more than dirt. Bad air, bad energy, the heaviness that clings to places like mildew. I had no appointment, no press release, no grand announcement. I had simply opened the door. She didn't look like I expected. Young, maybe 30, brown hair tied back, voice too cheerful for someone stepping into a space built from scars. She called the house quaint and asked if I minded a few questions. I didn't. I had lived too long fearing questions. Now I welcomed them, so long as they came with open ears. She asked about the name of the house. I told her memory named it, not me. She asked what the objects meant, and I told her they weren't objects. They were fragments, echoes, some of them mine, most of them other people's, sent in cardboard boxes or left on the porch in the middle of the night. I watched her face shift as she looked around, at the walls painted like forest bark, at the bundles of herbs drying from the ceiling beams, at the spiral symbols carved gently into doorframes, as if coaxed out of the wood. She touched nothing, but her eyes moved slowly, like someone walking through a field of graves. She stayed longer than she planned. When the article came out, it was on the third page of a local newspaper, under a title that made me wince, The Witch House of Hollow Creek. But the words were kind. She had listened. She had written things like ancestral reclamation and intergenerational healing. She had called me a quiet archivist of forgotten truths. People came, not in crowds, not with cameras or curiosity. They came one by one. A woman in her 60s who carried a pouch of river stones from her grandmother. A boy no older than 10 who asked if it was okay to cry. A man with thick glasses and trembling hands who said nothing, only stood before a wall of woven threads and breathed. They came with boxes, letters, photographs, bits of lace, buttons, broken jewelry, feathers, beads, cracked bones, things that meant nothing to anyone but everything to someone. They came not to give away their past, but to place it in a house that knew how to hold it. I let them. I never turned anyone away. Each offering found its place. I never arranged anything. The house did that. It guided me. I would hold an item and feel a pull to a shelf, a corner, a windowsill. It was never wrong. The girl, the one who had come in silence and stayed, became part of the house too. She never told me her story. I never asked. Her presence was enough. She swept the floors, painted over graffiti when it appeared, refilled the tea jar without being told. When new visitors came, she watched them closely, not with suspicion, but with recognition. Like she could see the places in them that had also been silenced. She wore the braid I'd tied on her wrist every day. I think I loved her. Not the way people think of love, not with titles or contracts or promises, but with the kind of love that exists between soil and seed. She reminded me of the girl I used to be. She reminded me of the daughter I never had. She reminded me that I wasn't done giving. Then came the night the pain returned. It started in my back, a slow burn that crept upward into my ribs, into my lungs, into the space behind my eyes. I brushed it off. Old bodies complain. That's what we're told. But by the third day, I couldn't stand without gasping. The girl found me collapsed on the floor of the herb room, surrounded by crushed rosemary and broken glass. She didn't cry. She called the ambulance. She rode with me to the hospital. held my hand when the nurse asked for next of kin, and answered, "She's my grandmother," without hesitation. They kept me for 3 days. In the stillness of the hospital bed, I listened to the machines breathe for me and wondered if the house was still standing, if the wind had loosened the windows, if the braid had unraveled. I missed the way the floors creaked beneath my feet. I missed the smell of sage. I missed the feeling of my own name echoing off those walls. On the 4th morning, she came. She brought a piece of wood, small and flat, carved roughly along the edges. On it, burned into the grain, was my name, Moirin. She didn't say where she had found it, whether she carved it herself or found it waiting for her in the house. But I didn't need to ask. I clutched it to my chest like a child. That night I dreamed of Etna, dreamed she was standing in the room with the spiral on the wall, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes soft and sure. She nodded at me. Not approval, not pride, just presence, just peace. When I returned home, the girl had cleaned every room. A vase of wildflowers sat on the altar. The braid she wore had frayed beyond repair, so I tied her a new one. Gold and blue this time, the colours of sky and memory. Visitors still came. Now they brought friends, they brought children. They brought stories not in words but in gestures. A caress on the wood, a finger tracing a crack, a tear caught before it fell. And one morning, as the wind stirred the chimes and the light hit the windows just right, I knew. I would not leave this house. Not in spirit, not in name. When my body gives out, and it will, soon, they will bury me beneath the oak I planted in the backyard. The one that grew from a single acorn carried in the folds of an old linen pouch. No headstone. No dates. Just a plaque. Burned into wood. The house that memory built. She remains. If this story spoke to you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Feel free to watch the other videos on the channel. They all carry something worth staying for. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.